The blade caught moonlight like a sliver of ice, and Ezekiel Thornwood watched his reflection fragment across its surface, a face he no longer recognized, eyes that had learned to see in absolute darkness. 3 nights he had spent with the whetstone, drawing the edge finer and finer until it could part hair suspended in air, until the metal sang a note so high only the horses could hear it. 3 nights of rhythmic scraping, the sound lost beneath the breathing of 12 animals who knew something in their master had changed, who shuffled nervously in their stalls and rolled their white-rimmed eyes toward the corner where Zeke sat cross-legged on packed earth that smelled of hay and manure and the sweat that had poured from his body for 28 years. October in Mississippi still carried summer's weight. The air inside the stables hung thick and wet, pressing against Zeke's skin like a second flesh he could not shed. He wore only his work trousers, his chest bare and gleaming in the bands of silver light that leaked through gaps in the plank walls. Each breath came measured, controlled, the way he had learned to control everything about himself since the day 14 years ago when Master Blackridge purchased him at auction in Natchez, when iron shackles had replaced the iron shackles he'd worn since birth on a plantation in Virginia whose name he had trained himself to forget. The bay mare in the nearest stall, Juniper, named by Mistress Cordelia who had never touched a horse in her life, nickered softly and pawed the ground. Zeke raised his eyes to her without moving his head. "Hush now," he whispered, and his voice sounded strange even to himself, hollowed out, echoing up from someplace deep and lightless. "Won't be long now. You'll have peace after." He stood in a single fluid motion, his body remembering the economy of movement that plantation life had beaten into him, never a wasted gesture, never drawing attention, becoming invisible in plain sight. The blade felt alive in his hand, worn now from contact with his palm, the wooden handle worn smooth by the hands of whatever white man had owned it before Zeke had stolen it from the tack room 3 days ago. A skinning knife, meant for rabbits and deer, for carving meat from bone. He had thought about that, how little difference there was between animals in the end, how all flesh parted the same beneath a sharp enough edge. Against the back wall, stacked to the rafters, stood bales of hay and sacks of feed, 50 pounds each, their burlap surfaces stamped with the merchant's mark from Vicksburg. Zeke had hauled them from the wagon just last week, his shoulders screaming, his hands bleeding through the calluses, while Dalton Crow sat on the porch of his cottage and drank whiskey and watched. Crow always watched. He had a way of looking that felt like hands, that crawled across skin and burrowed beneath it, searching for the places where a man kept his dignity hidden away. Zeke crossed to the feed sacks now, his bare feet silent on the stable floor. He selected one at random, though he had already chosen it 2 nights ago when he began practicing, when he needed to know if his hands would remember when the time came, if muscle memory would carry him through when thought became impossible. The sack hung at chest height, suspended from a roof beam by rope he had rigged himself, swaying slightly in the thick air. He positioned himself at the proper distance, close enough to reach, far enough to move. The horses had gone quiet, as if they understood this was a kind of prayer, a ritual that required reverence and silence. Zeke closed his eyes and let himself remember, though remembering was a knife all its own, sharper than the one he held. Temperance. Her name had been Sarah when she arrived at Blackridge 5 years ago, a girl of 19 with eyes that held more sorrow than seemed possible in someone so young, and hands that moved with the practiced grace of someone who had been trained for housework. Master Blackridge had purchased her from an estate sale, some gentleman planter who had drunk and gambled himself to death and whose widow needed to liquidate assets to satisfy creditors. Zeke had seen Sarah on her first day, had watched her disappear into the main house, and had felt nothing beyond the dull acknowledgement that there was another soul trapped in the same hell. But then she had appeared at the stables 3 weeks later, sent by Mistress Cordelia to tell Zeke that the master's riding horse needed new shoes, and when she spoke his name, Ezekiel. It sounded like a question, like she was asking if he was real, if he was still human beneath the mask of obedience and silence. He had looked into her eyes and seen recognition there, not of him specifically, but of shared suffering, shared survival, and something else, a flicker of defiance that had not yet been extinguished. They had spoken in fragments, stolen moments when Zeke brought firewood to the kitchen door, when Sarah slipped out to the well after dark for water that was not for drinking but for washing away the day's degradation. They invented a language of glances and half-words, careful never to draw attention, never to give the whites any reason to notice that 2 enslaved people had found in each other a small island of humanity in an ocean of cruelty. When they married, though it was not marriage in any legal sense, could never be marriage when enslaved people were property that could be sold and separated on a master's whim, Zeke had carved her a ring from a piece of oak and told her his mother's name had been Temperance, that she had died when he was 8, that he wanted to give Sarah something of his own, a name that belonged to them and not to Master Blackridge. She had taken it, had become Temperance, and for 3 years they had built a life in the margins, a life so small and careful it might have been invisible except to those who lived it. When Mercy was born last spring, impossibly tiny and perfect and screaming with rage at being thrust into this world, Zeke had held her in the darkness of their cabin and wept for the first time since childhood. He had wept because she was beautiful, and because she was enslaved, and because he could not protect her from what was coming, could only love her in the spaces between suffering. Dalton Crow had noticed Temperance the week Mercy was born. Had started finding reasons to be near the kitchen, to linger when he brought instructions from Master Blackridge, to let his eyes crawl over her body with that proprietary assessment that white men wore like a birthright. Temperance had avoided him with the practiced skill of a woman who understood the geometry of predation, who knew how to position her body to minimize vulnerability, how to make herself uninteresting without seeming to refuse. But Crow was patient, and he was the overseer, which meant he held power over every aspect of their lives, when they woke, when they worked, when they ate, when they slept, and whether they lived or died. 3 weeks ago he had cornered Temperance in the root cellar, had put his hands on her, had made his intentions explicit. She had refused him clearly, and in refusing had violated the fundamental law of plantation existence, that the enslaved had no right to refuse anything a white person desired. Crow's revenge had been elegant in its cruelty. He had gone to Master Blackridge with a fabricated story about Temperance stealing silver, about finding spoons hidden in her cabin. Master Blackridge, who prided himself on being a reasonable man who treated his property well, had nonetheless recognized that a house slave who stole could not be trusted, and moreover could not be allowed to remain unpunished lest other enslaved people get ideas. The punishment was sale. And because Mercy was still nursing, still dependent on her mother, the baby would be sold too. A Louisiana sugar plantation had paid good money for a healthy young woman and an infant girl. The transaction had taken less than an hour. Zeke had not been permitted to say goodbye. He opened his eyes. The feed sack swayed before him, burlap skin stretched over grain that shifted like muscle, like a throat. Zeke raised the knife and stepped forward, his body moving with the terrible precision of 3 nights' practice, and drove the blade into the sack at the angle he had perfected, entering just below where the jawbone would be, sweeping across and up in a single fluid motion, deep enough to sever everything vital, quick enough to prevent any sound beyond a wet sigh of escaping air. Grain poured from the wound in a golden stream that hissed against the stable floor. Zeke watched it pool at his feet, watched the moonlight turn it silver, and felt something inside himself tear open just as cleanly. He had crossed a threshold that existed only in his mind but was no less real for being invisible. He had decided. He had prepared. And now, standing in the suffocating darkness with a knife in his hand and murder in his heart, Ezekiel Thornwood was no longer entirely human, had become instead a weapon shaped by cruelty and pointed back at its source. The horses were silent now, absolutely silent, as if they understood that the man they had known for 6 years was gone, replaced by something that wore his face but moved through the world with a predator's patience. Zeke cleaned the blade on his trousers and walked to the stable door. Through the gap he could see the overseer's cottage, 50 yards across packed earth, a single candle burning in the window where Dalton Crow sat drinking whiskey and reading scripture, as he did every night, finding justification in Leviticus and Ephesians for the evil he enacted daily. Zeke tested the door, felt it swing open on hinges he had oiled 2 nights ago, eliminating even the whisper of wood on wood. The October air hit his chest, cooler outside the stables, carrying the smell of tobacco from the drying barns and magnolia from the trees that lined the drive to the main house. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. The plantation slept, unaware that one of its ghosts had learned to bleed the living. He stepped out of the stables and let the darkness swallow him whole. If this story is gripping you, subscribe and drop a comment below with your thoughts on what drives a man past the point of no return. The distance between the stables and Dalton Crow's cottage was precisely 73 paces. Zeke had counted them 1,000 times, carrying tack for repair, delivering messages from Master Blackridge, fetching the overseer for emergencies real and manufactured. 73 paces that he had walked with his eyes down and his shoulders curved in the posture of submission that white men required, that they interpreted as natural deference rather than what it truly was, a survival mechanism as instinctive as breathing. Tonight he crossed the distance in 68 paces, his stride longer, his body moving with the fluid economy of something hunting. The blade hung loose in his right hand, no longer catching moonlight because he held it angled down and back, invisible against his leg. His breathing remained controlled, measured, each inhalation drawn deep into his belly the way his mother had taught him before she died, before Virginia, before everything. When you are scared, she had whispered, you breathe shallow, up in your chest, and that fear gets bigger. You breathe down deep, you breathe like the earth itself, and fear gets smaller. Makes room for what needs doing. What needed doing hung in his mind with terrible clarity. The cottage door stood slightly ajar. Crow always left it open a crack in summer and fall, claiming he needed the air circulation, though Zeke suspected it was vanity, a way of showing he had no fear of the enslaved people who surrounded him, that he slept secure in the knowledge of his power. A foolish vanity. The kind that got men killed. Zeke paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness inside. The single candle burned on a table near the window, illuminating Crow's Bible and an empty whiskey glass, but the overseer himself sat in a chair angled toward the fireplace, though no fire burned this warm night. His head had lolled to one side, his breathing heavy and regular with drink and exhaustion. He wore only his trousers and an undershirt, suspenders hanging loose at his sides, his boots kicked off and lying on their sides like dead animals. The floor was wood, not packed earth like the slave cabins, and wood had a way of announcing intrusion with creaks and groans, a language of betrayal. But Zeke had been in this cottage before, knew which boards sang and which stayed silent, and he moved like water around the treacherous places, flowing across the room until he stood directly behind Crow's chair, close enough to smell the whiskey sweat that poured from the man's skin, close enough to see the pink scalp showing through thinning hair. Crow was 34 years old, originally from South Carolina, a younger son who had learned early that he would inherit nothing and must therefore make his own way. He had arrived at Blackridge 3 years ago with references that praised his efficiency and his understanding of Negro management, which meant he knew precisely how much brutality to apply to extract maximum labor while minimizing mortality, a balance that required constant calibration, constant attention to the point where discipline became counterproductive. He was good at his work. Master Blackridge had increased cotton yields by 18% since Crow's arrival. He had also taken temperance and mercy from Zeke, had sent them to a sugar plantation where the life expectancy of field workers was measured in years, not decades, where the labor was so brutal that planters found it more economical to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to maintain their health for the long term. Zeke raised the knife. His hand trembled, not from fear or hesitation, but from the physical effort of keeping the motion controlled when every muscle in his body screamed to simply plunge the blade down with all his strength, to stab and stab and stab until the rage that lived in his chest found some release. But rage was noise, and noise was death. This had to be silent. This had to be surgical. He reached down with his left hand and clamped it over Crow's mouth, fingers digging into the soft flesh of cheeks, thumb pressing hard against the nose to cut off air. Crow's eyes snapped open instantly, the reflexes of a man accustomed to danger, and in the candlelight Zeke watched recognition bloom in those pale blue eyes, watched shock give way to understanding give way to something that might have been fear or might have been outrage, it didn't matter which. For temperance, Zeke whispered, and drew the blade across Crow's throat. The knife was sharp enough that Zeke felt almost no resistance, just a slight catch as the edge found windpipe and then the hot rush of blood over his hand, over Crow's chest, pouring down in a cascade that looked black in the dim light. Crow's body convulsed, his hands coming up to grab at Zeke's arm, but the strength was already draining from him, flowing out with his life, and his fingers merely scrabbled uselessly against skin. His mouth worked behind Zeke's palm, trying to scream or beg or curse, but producing only a wet gurgling that grew fainter and fainter until it stopped entirely. Zeke held him until the body went completely slack, until he was certain, and then lowered Crow forward so the blood would pour onto the floor rather than the chair. He stepped back and looked at his work. His right hand was slick with blood up to the wrist, his left hand still tingled where Crow's lips had pressed against it in that final moment. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no relief. Just a vast emptiness that might have been peace or might have been the first stage of whatever madness awaited him at the end of this night. He wiped the blade on Crow's shirt and left the cottage as silently as he had entered. The night air felt impossibly clean after the blood-thick atmosphere inside, and Zeke stood for a moment breathing it in, letting it clear his head. Somewhere to his left, near the tobacco barns, he could hear singing. Someone was awake, probably Silas Pettigrew, one of 3 white men who served as night watchmen, patrolling the plantation to prevent fires, theft, or escape attempts. Pettigrew was a drunkard who spent most of his shifts sitting on bales and nursing a jug of corn whiskey, but he was awake, and awake men could sound alarms. Zeke moved toward the singing. The tobacco barns stood in a row at the eastern edge of the plantation, massive structures where the harvested leaves hung from rafters to dry and cure, filling the air with a sweet sharp smell that clung to everything. Pettigrew sat on a barrel outside the middle barn, just as Zeke had expected, his rifle propped against the wall behind him, a clay jug cradled in his lap. He was singing something Zeke didn't recognize, a maudlin tune about a girl left behind in Georgia, his voice thin and wavering and tuneless. Zeke approached from behind, using the barn itself as cover, moving along its length until he stood in the deep shadow cast by the eaves. Pettigrew was 60 if he was a day, a man broken by drink and bad choices, reduced to this, guarding tobacco for $3 a week and whatever whiskey he could steal. Zeke felt something twist in his chest that might have been pity, but pity was a luxury he could no longer afford. Pettigrew wore a white face, and tonight all white faces were the same, were Crow's face, were Master Blackridge's face, were the faces of every man who had ever looked at Zeke and seen property instead of person. He waited until Pettigrew tilted the jug back for another drink, waited until the man's eyes were skyward and his throat was exposed and vulnerable, and then he moved. 3 quick steps brought him behind the barrel, and his left hand snaked around to clamp over Pettigrew's mouth while his right brought the knife across in that same practiced motion, opening the throat from ear to ear. Pettigrew dropped the jug. It shattered on the packed earth with a sound like a gunshot, and Zeke's heart stopped for one terrible moment, but no alarm was raised, no voices called out. The night absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. Pettigrew died without ever fully understanding what had happened, his eyes glazing over with confusion more than fear, and Zeke lowered him to the ground and moved on. 2 down. 12 to go. Abner Sickle was making his rounds near the slave quarters when Zeke found him, walking the perimeter with his rifle slung over one shoulder and a lantern in his hand. Sickle was competent, alert, dangerous, a former militiaman who took his duties seriously and had been known to fire warning shots at shadows. Zeke could not approach him directly, could not rely on surprise alone. He picked up a stone and threw it at the nearest cabin, and heard it clatter against the wooden wall. Sickle stopped immediately, raising his lantern and calling out, "Who's there? Show yourself." His hand moved to his rifle, sliding it off his shoulder, and he began walking toward the sound, away from the quarters and toward the tree line where Zeke crouched in darkness. "I said show yourself, God damn it." Zeke threw another stone, this one deeper into the trees, and Sickle followed it like a hound on a scent. He pushed into the underbrush, lantern held high, rifle ready, and Zeke flowed behind him silent as smoke. When Sickle stopped to listen, Zeke stopped. When Sickle moved forward, Zeke closed the distance. And when Sickle finally lowered his lantern and started to turn back, muttering about coons or possums, Zeke was there. The knife found its target before Sickle could bring his rifle around. Zeke clamped a hand over the man's mouth and held him while he died, feeling the life run out hot over his fingers, and then dragged the body deeper into the trees where it wouldn't be found until morning, if then. 3 down. The last of the night watchman was Josiah Fitch, and Zeke found him near the cotton gin, a silhouette against the star-filled sky. Fitch was young, maybe 22, a farm boy from Alabama who had taken this job to earn money to buy his own land someday. He had never struck an enslaved person in Zeke's presence, had sometimes even offered a nod of greeting when their paths crossed, as close to human decency as a white man could offer without violating the social order that kept the whole rotten system functioning. Zeke stood watching him for a long moment, the knife heavy in his hand, and felt something crack inside his chest. Fitch was humming to himself, some tune his mother had probably taught him, and in that moment he was just a boy, just another person trying to survive in a world that ground most people to dust regardless of the color of their skin. But he wore a white face, and he served the system, and the system had to burn. Zeke crossed the distance between them and opened Fitch's throat before the boy even knew he was there. He died still humming, the sound trailing off into a wet silence, and Zeke caught his body as it fell, lowering it gently to the ground. He closed the boy's eyes with blood-sticky fingers and whispered, "I'm sorry," knowing the words were meaningless, knowing sorry changed nothing, knowing he would kill him again given the choice because there was no other choice, not anymore, not after temperance and mercy, not after 28 years of being less than human in the eyes of men like these. 4 down. The main house waited, white columns gleaming in the moonlight like bones, like a mausoleum for the living. Zeke moved toward it, a ghost drenched in blood, and the night held its breath. The kitchen door stood where it had always stood, at the rear of the main house beneath a small portico where Mistress Cordelia grew herbs in clay pots, basil and thyme and rosemary that she never touched herself but had the house slaves harvest for her table. Zeke had passed through this door 1,000 times carrying firewood, had stacked it in the box beside the great hearth where cook prepared meals that fed the Blackridge family while the enslaved ate cornmeal mush and whatever scraps could be scavenged. The door was never locked. Why would it be? Who would dare enter uninvited? Zeke eased it open, the hinges silent because he had oiled them himself just last month, and stepped into the kitchen. The darkness here felt different than outside, thicker, more oppressive, weighted with the memory of labor and heat and the small humiliations that accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until they built a foundation of rage so deep it could support any atrocity. The great hearth held only embers now, casting a faint red glow that turned the hanging pots and pans into shadows of shadows. Zeke moved past them, past the long preparation table where he had seen Temperance work 100 times, her hands swift and sure as she kneaded bread or peeled potatoes or plucked chickens, her face carefully blank in the way all enslaved people learned to make their faces blank, revealing nothing that could be used against them. He could see her now, standing at that table, her belly swollen with mercy, and the image was so vivid that for a moment he forgot she was gone, forgot he was here with a blade dripping blood onto the kitchen floor. Then reality reasserted itself with the force of a physical blow, and the emptiness inside him grew larger, became a void that threatened to swallow him whole. The servants' quarters opened off the kitchen, a narrow hallway with 3 doors, behind which slept the house slaves who made the Blackridge family's comfort possible. Old Dinah, the cook, who had been at Blackridge longer than anyone could remember. Young Letty, who cleaned and did laundry and bore Nathaniel Blackridge's wandering hands with the stoicism of someone who understood that resistance meant being sold or worse. And Solomon, the butler, who moved through the house like a specter, always present and never seen, his face a mask of dignified servitude that revealed nothing of what lived behind his eyes. Zeke paused at the hallway entrance. These were his people. They had mourned with him when Temperance and Mercy were sold, had brought him food when he could not eat, had sat with him in silence because there were no words adequate to the horror of a man watching his family torn away. To wake them now would force them to choose, to join him or to stop him or to simply bear witness to what he had become. He could not ask that of them. This was his burden, his sin, his damnation. He left them sleeping and moved toward the main staircase. The house above the kitchen was a different world, one Zeke had glimpsed but never truly entered. The hallway opened into a grand foyer where a chandelier hung dark and silent, its crystals catching faint starlight from the windows and throwing patterns across walls papered with scenes of European countryside, a pastoral fantasy that had nothing to do with Mississippi, nothing to do with the cotton fields that generated the wealth that purchased such luxuries. The staircase curved upward in an elegant sweep, its banister polished mahogany that gleamed even in darkness. Zeke climbed the stairs, one hand on the rail to steady himself, the other clutching the knife. His feet left bloody prints on the carpet runner, a trail of evidence that would tell the story of his passage, but evidence no longer mattered. By the time anyone found these prints, everything would be finished. At the top of the stairs the hallway split in 2 directions. To the left, the master bedroom where Bartholomew and Cordelia Blackridge slept in a bed large enough to hold 6 people, on sheets made of Egyptian cotton picked by hands that looked like Zeke's hands, woven by machines built with money made from labor that looked like Zeke's labor. To the right, the guest wing where Nathaniel Blackridge and his new bride Arabella occupied separate but adjoining rooms in the fashion of wealthy newlyweds who maintained certain proprieties even in marriage. Zeke turned left. The master bedroom door was closed but not locked, another vanity, another assumption of security that came from never having to fear the people you owned. Zeke tested the handle, felt it turn smoothly, and pushed the door open inch by careful inch until he could slip through the gap. The room was enormous, larger than the cabin where Zeke had lived with Temperance and Mercy, larger than any space he had ever occupied for his own use. A 4-poster bed dominated the center, its curtains drawn back to allow air circulation, and in that bed lay Master Bartholomew Blackridge and his wife Cordelia, 2 shapes beneath white sheets that rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep. Zeke stood at the foot of the bed and watched them breathe. Bartholomew was 56 years old, a second-generation planter who had inherited Blackridge from his father and expanded it from 400 acres to nearly 2,000, from 30 enslaved people to over 140. He was considered a progressive master by his peers. He allowed his enslaved people to marry, permitted them small garden plots, rarely used the whip except when absolutely necessary. He had rules about the treatment of pregnant women, limits on the separation of mothers from young children, a whole philosophy of management that he expounded upon at dinner parties, explaining to other planters that properly treated property was more productive property, that a certain degree of humanity in the system benefited everyone involved. He had sold temperance and mercy for $1,200 without blinking. Cordelia was 43, the daughter of a cotton broker in Natchez, educated at a seminary for young ladies where she had learned to paint watercolors and play pianoforte and manage a household of enslaved people with the same calm efficiency she applied to flower arrangements. She had never struck anyone herself, had never even raised her voice in Zeke's hearing, but she had stood in the parlor while Dalton Crow explained about the stolen silver, had nodded thoughtfully and agreed that yes, a thief could not be tolerated, had even suggested Louisiana as a destination because she had heard the prices were good there currently. Zeke moved to Bartholomew's side of the bed first. The master slept on his back, his mouth slightly open, his graying beard neatly trimmed even in sleep. His hands lay folded across his chest like a corpse already prepared for viewing, and Zeke felt a hysterical laugh trying to claw its way up his throat. How convenient, how considerate of the master to arrange himself for slaughter. He raised the knife and then paused, his hand frozen in midair. For a moment the scene before him seemed to fragment, to become multiple overlapping images. Bartholomew Blackridge asleep in his bed, Bartholomew Blackridge standing in the parlor discussing business with his factor, Bartholomew Blackridge on horseback riding past the cotton fields where men and women and children worked from sunup to sundown, Bartholomew Blackridge at supper discussing the weather and crop yields and the problem of abolitionists while Zeke stood against the wall holding a serving platter, invisible, less than furniture. Which one should he kill? Which one was real? Were any of them real or were they all just masks worn by something that had learned to mimic humanity without ever truly possessing it? The knife descended. Bartholomew Blackridge woke in the instant before the blade found his throat, his eyes snapping open with the pre-animal awareness of imminent death, and he saw Zeke standing over him. Recognition flashed across his face, not of danger, not of threat, but of profound confusion. His property had entered his bedroom with a knife. The natural order of things had inverted. This was impossible. This could not be happening. Then the blade opened his throat and he understood, finally, that it was happening, that impossible things became possible when you built your world on the backs of people you convinced yourself were not fully human. He died reaching for his wife, his hand falling across her body in a gesture that might have been protection or might have been habit. Cordelia woke to her husband's blood splashing across her nightgown. She drew breath to scream and Zeke clamped his hand over her mouth, the same hand that had silenced Dalton Crow, now slick with Bartholomew's blood. She stared up at him with eyes gone wide with terror, and he stared back, and for one long moment they were simply two people looking at each other across a chasm so vast that no bridge could ever span it. "You stood there," Zeke whispered. "You stood in that parlor and you let him sell my wife. My daughter. You stood there and you smiled." Cordelia's eyes rolled wildly, seeking escape, seeking help, seeking anything but the face of the man who had served her for 6 years and whom she had never truly seen. She tried to speak behind his palm, tried to plead or bargain or reason, but Zeke had moved beyond reason, had entered a space where words held no meaning and only blood could speak. He killed her quickly, more quickly than he had killed her husband, and told himself it was mercy though he knew it was only exhaustion, the first cracks forming in whatever vessel held him together. The adjoining rooms came next. Nathaniel First, 28 years old, handsome in the way of young men who had never known hardship, who had been raised to believe the world existed for their pleasure. He had forced himself on Letty twice that Zeke knew of, probably more times that he didn't. He died in his sleep, never waking, and Zeke envied him that peaceful passage even as he hated him for earning it so easily. Arabella's room was last. She was 19, married to Nathaniel only 3 months ago in a ceremony that had brought half of Mississippi's planter class to Blackridge for a week of celebration and excess. Zeke had served at that wedding, had carried trays of champagne and delicacies while Temperance worked in the kitchen preparing food for people who would never acknowledge her existence beyond the utility of her labor. Arabella had been kind to her servants that week, had said please and thank you in a soft Virginia accent, had even remarked to Cordelia that the house staff seemed very well trained. 2 weeks later, Temperance was sold. Zeke stood over Arabella's sleeping form and felt something inside him finally break, not dramatically but quietly, like a rope fraying strand by strand until only one thread holds the weight and then that thread snaps and everything it supports falls. She was innocent. She was guilty. She was both and neither. She had done nothing except exist within a system that demanded her complicity, and her complicity was absolute because she benefited from every atrocity even if she never personally enacted them. Her face in sleep looked heartbreakingly young. She could have been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's beloved. But she was also the future of Blackridge, the womb that would produce the next generation of masters, and Zeke could not allow that future to unfold. He pressed his hand over her mouth and she woke, and in her eyes he saw not Arabella but every white face that had ever looked through him, past him, around him, never quite at him. He saw the accumulated weight of 28 years of not existing as a person, only as a function. He saw Temperance's face and Mercy's face and his mother's face and the faces of every enslaved person who had died or suffered or endured the unendurable so that people like Arabella could sleep in silk sheets. The knife did its work. The house fell silent again. Zeke stood in the hallway, alone with 4 corpses and the sound of his own breathing. Dawn was still hours away. There was still work to do. If you're still with me through this descent into darkness, subscribe and leave a comment about the moral complexities of resistance born from systematic dehumanization. Zeke descended the main staircase mechanically, his feet finding each step without conscious thought, his body moving through space while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and vast where time moved differently or perhaps did not move at all. Blood had dried tacky on his hands and forearms, had soaked into his trousers until the fabric clung to his thighs. He could smell it now, copper-sharp and organic, mixing with his own sweat to create a perfume of violence that seemed to announce his presence to the sleeping house. At the base of the stairs he paused, suddenly aware that he was not alone. Solomon stood in the doorway to the kitchen, a candle in his hand, its flame casting shadows that made his dark face seem carved from stone. He was 60 years old, had been butler at Blackridge for 30 years, had watched Zeke arrive as a man of 14 and had taught him the invisible choreography of service, how to stand, where to look, when to speak and when to remain silent. His eyes moved from Zeke's face to the knife in his hand to the bloody footprints on the stairs, and his expression did not change, revealed nothing. For a long moment they stood looking at each other across the foyer, across the distance between who Zeke had been yesterday and what he had become tonight, and then Solomon spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "How many?" 8. Zeke's voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. "Crow, the watchman, the family. All of them upstairs." Solomon nodded slowly, as if Zeke had simply reported completing some routine task. "There are 6 more who need answering for." 6. Master Blackridge's brother-in-law is here. Edmund Fairweather. Arrived this evening from Vicksburg, staying in the guest cottage. The physician, Dr. Wendell, is in the overseer's quarters, was attending to some business with Crow. Caleb Marsh sleeps in the building by the cotton gin. And Reverend Blackwood is in the library, fell asleep reading his scripture. Zeke stared at Solomon, trying to understand what was happening, trying to parse whether this was help or trap or something else entirely. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've started something that can't be stopped halfway. Because they sold your wife and daughter and they'll sell mine next month when Master," Solomon stopped, corrected himself. "When Master Blackridge was planning to settle his debts. Because I'm 60 years old and I'm tired of serving men who think ownership of my body gives them ownership of my soul." The candle flame wavered between them, casting shadows that danced like spirits. "There are others," Solomon continued. "Isaac Drummond lost his son to Marsh's whip 3 years ago. Ruth Colby has endured Nathaniel's attention since she was 15. Young Tommy from the stables worships the ground you walk on. They're awake now. They know something is happening. They're waiting to see if this is real or just another dream of freedom that dies with morning." Zeke felt something shift inside his chest, a weight redistributing itself, and he realized with a clarity that was almost painful that he was no longer alone in this. The choice he had made in the darkness of the stables had rippled outward, had touched others, and now they were choosing too. The revolt was no longer his alone to carry. "Where are they?" "Behind the kitchen. I told them to wait." Zeke followed Solomon through the kitchen and out the back door into the small yard where vegetables grew in neat rows for the master's table. 3 figures stood in the shadows beneath a magnolia tree, their faces invisible but their forms distinct: Isaac, tall and broad-shouldered despite his 60-some years, Ruth, slight and motionless, and Tommy, barely 16, vibrating with nervous energy. Isaac spoke first. "Solomon says you killed them." "The family." "All of them?" "Yes." "Good." The word came out flat, without emphasis, a simple statement of fact. Isaac stepped forward into the faint light from the kitchen window and Zeke saw that he held a hatchet, its blade dark with rust or perhaps with something else. "Marsh whipped my boy to death for breaking a wagon axle." Accident, pure and simple, but Marsh said it was negligence, said it was sabotage. Whipped him until he stopped moving and then kept whipping. I held Marcus while he died and I promised him then that there would be a reckoning. Ruth moved next, producing from somewhere in her dress a long knife, the kind used for butchering hogs. Her voice when she spoke was soft, almost dreamy. Nathaniel came to my cabin 47 times. I counted. Every time, I counted. And every time after, Mistress Cordelia would look at me with these cold eyes, like I had seduced him, like I had chosen what he did. 47 times. I'm glad you killed him. I'm glad you killed them both. Tommy had armed himself with a hammer, heavy and meant for driving fence posts. He said nothing, just looked at Zeke with something approaching worship, and Zeke felt a stab of something that might have been shame or might have been fear for what he had made of this boy. There are 6 more, Zeke said. Solomon knows where they are. After that. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish the sentence. After that what? After that they run. After that they die. After that the world changes or after that it stays exactly the same except 6 more dead white men. After that we burn it, Isaac said. Burn the house, burn the cotton, burn everything the Blackridges built on our backs. Let them find ashes and bodies and nothing else. Zeke nodded. Yes. Fire. Purification. The erasure of everything Blackridge had been. The guest cottage first, Solomon said. Edmund Fairweather. He's the one who arranged the sale of your wife, Zeke. He's a factor, buys and sells human beings the way other men trade livestock. He has a wife and 3 daughters back in Vicksburg, has a reputation as a Christian gentleman who treats his slaves well. He sold Temperance and Mercy for $1,200 and took his commission. The rage that Zeke had thought was exhausted suddenly found new fuel. He started toward the guest cottage and the others followed, 5 ghosts moving through the October night, 5 weapons moving toward their targets with the inevitability of a stopped clock finally released. Edmund Fairweather died without waking, Isaac's hatchet ending him before he could even open his eyes. They left him there and moved to the overseer's quarters where Dr. Horace Wendell slept in Dalton Crow's bed, having apparently grown too drunk on Crow's whiskey to make it back to town. Wendell had treated the Blackridge family's ailments for 15 years and had never once offered medical care to an enslaved person unless that person's illness threatened productivity. He had sewn up wounds from whippings, had set bones broken by brutality, and had done it all with the detached efficiency of a man repairing farm equipment. Ruth killed him. She climbed onto the bed and sat on his chest and put her knife through his throat while he woke and struggled and finally understood that the girl he had examined after Nathaniel's assaults, the girl he had told to stop complaining about the pain, was now taking payment for services rendered. Caleb Marsh was next. The slave driver slept in a small building near the cotton gin, separated from both the enslaved people and the whites, belonging fully to neither world. Marsh was the son of a white overseer and an enslaved woman, raised in the margins, and had learned early that his survival depended on proving his loyalty to whiteness, on being more brutal to his mother's people than any white man could be. He had beaten, whipped, and degraded enslaved people at Blackridge for 7 years, and they hated him with a purity of loathing that exceeded their hatred of the whites because Marsh had chosen his allegiance where the whites had merely inherited theirs. Isaac and Tommy went together. They found Marsh awake, apparently unable to sleep, sitting at his small table cleaning his pistol by lamplight. He looked up when they entered, his mixed-race face registering first surprise, then understanding, then something that might have been resignation. He reached for the pistol but Tommy's hammer caught him in the temple before his fingers closed on the grip. Isaac finished him with the hatchet, and neither man spoke. Reverend Josiah Blackwood was the last, and they found him where Solomon had said, in the library, asleep in a leather chair with a Bible open in his lap. He was 71 years old, had preached at the Blackridge family church for 30 years, had delivered countless sermons about the godly order of master and servant, about how slavery was ordained by Scripture, about how the enslaved should obey their earthly masters as they would obey their heavenly master. He had baptized Nathaniel Blackridge and married him to Arabella. He had prayed over Bartholomew's meals and blessed his enterprises. He had never once acknowledged that enslaved people had souls worth saving. Zeke stood over him, the knife heavy in his hand, and felt nothing. No rage, no satisfaction, no horror. Just a vast emptiness that had consumed everything that had once been Ezekiel Thornwood and left behind only this, a shell that moved and breathed and killed but no longer felt. He drew the blade across Blackwood's throat and the old man died without waking, blood spilling across the pages of his Bible, obscuring the words in Ephesians about servants obeying their masters, about slaves submitting to their earthly lords. The book fell from his lap and landed on the floor with a wet sound. 14. 14 throats opened in the darkness. 14 lives ended. 14 souls sent to whatever judgment awaited them. Zeke turned to face the others and saw in their faces a mirror of what he felt, exhaustion and emptiness and something that might have been liberation or might have been damnation. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become something new and terrible and perhaps necessary. "Burn it," Isaac said again. "Burn it all." They moved through the house lighting fires, using candles and lamp oil and the simple chemistry of flame and dry wood. The kitchen first, then the parlor, then the bedrooms upstairs where the bodies lay cooling in their sheets. They piled furniture, draped curtains, and created channels for the fire to follow. Solomon moved through the house he had served for 30 years and showed no emotion as he consigned it to ashes. Outside, they set fire to the cotton in the barns, to the tobacco in the curing sheds, to the overseer's cottage and the slave driver's quarters. The flames caught quickly in the dry October air and spread with hungry enthusiasm, consuming everything they touched, turning years of labor and wealth into smoke and heat. By the time the sun rose, Blackridge Plantation was an inferno, black smoke towering into the dawn sky like a monument to rage long suppressed and finally, catastrophically released. And in the woods beyond the property line, 5 figures moved toward the river, toward an uncertain future, toward whatever consequences awaited those who refused to remain silent in the face of their own annihilation. The river appeared through the trees like a promise written in dark water, its surface catching the first pale light of dawn and throwing it back broken and scattered. The Yazoo River, brown and sluggish and indifferent to the desperate calculations of men, flowing south toward the Mississippi, toward Louisiana, toward the place where temperance and mercy had been taken 3 weeks ago to die slowly in cane fields under a sun that burned white and merciless. Zeke stood on the muddy bank and watched the water move, watched it carry leaves and branches and the occasional bloated carcass of some animal that had misjudged the current. Behind him, perhaps 5 miles distant now, a column of black smoke rose into the morning sky, visible for miles in every direction, announcing to all of Mississippi that something had happened at Blackridge, that the natural order had been violated, that enslaved people had risen up and killed their masters and burned everything to ash. The alarm would be raised soon if it hadn't been already. Men on horseback would converge on the plantation, would find the bodies, would piece together what had happened from blood trails and footprints and the simple arithmetic of missing slaves. Dogs would be brought. Militia would be called. Every white person in the county would remember suddenly that they lived surrounded by people who had every reason to kill them, who outnumbered them, who worked their fields and cleaned their houses and stood in their presence invisible until the moment they decided to become visible with knives in their hands. The retribution would be savage and indiscriminate. Enslaved people who had nothing to do with Blackridge would be whipped or hanged as examples. Laws would be passed making the already impossible more impossible. The system would tighten like a fist around a throat and squeeze until something broke. But for now, at this moment, Zeke was free. The thought arrived in his mind without fanfare, just a simple statement of fact that seemed simultaneously profound and meaningless. He was free. He was also damned. Perhaps they were the same thing. We should split up. Isaac stood to Zeke's right, his clothes stained with soot and blood, the hatchet still gripped in his right hand as if it had become a permanent extension of his arm. 5 moving together will be easier to track. 2 groups of 2 and 1 alone has better odds. Solomon nodded his agreement. He had remained silent since they fled Blackridge, his face carved into an expression of such profound weariness that he looked ancient, looked like he had lived 100 lifetimes in a single night. Ruth and I will go east, toward Alabama. I have a sister who was sold to a plantation near Tuscaloosa 20 years ago. Don't know if she's still alive, but it's a direction. Ruth stood apart from the group, staring at her reflection in the water as if seeing herself for the first time. Her dress was torn, her hand still clutched the butchering knife, and her eyes held a distance that suggested she had departed her body sometime during the night and not yet fully returned. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the sound of the river. I killed him. I sat on his chest and I felt him die beneath me and I'm glad. Does that make me evil? No one answered. The question was rhetorical or perhaps it was the only question that mattered, and either way there were no words adequate to address it. Isaac cleared his throat. I'm heading north. Memphis, then maybe across into Missouri. There are Quakers up there who help runaways, or so I've heard. Might be lies, might be truth, but north is the only direction that makes sense. He looked at Tommy, who had remained close to Zeke's side like a shadow. Boy, you should come with me. I can move faster than most despite my age, and I know how to avoid roads and people. Tommy shook his head. I'm staying with Zeke. Tommy, Zeke started, but the boy cut him off. I said I'm staying with you. You taught me how to work horses, how to gentle them and gain their trust. You're the only person at Blackridge who ever treated me like I mattered. I'm not leaving you. Zeke wanted to argue, wanted to send the boy away with Isaac, wanted to protect him from whatever end awaited those who had participated in the Blackridge massacre. But he was too tired to argue, too hollowed out to do anything but accept this final burden. All right. You stay with me. We'll follow the river south. South? Solomon's eyebrows rose. That's toward the heart of it, toward Louisiana, toward more plantations and more danger. I know. Zeke looked at the water, at the way it flowed inexorably toward the Mississippi, toward the Gulf, toward the end of all things. Temperance and mercy are somewhere down there. I know I can't reach them, can't save them, but I need to move toward them anyway. Need to die moving in their direction if dying is what comes next. The logic was insane, the reasoning of a man whose mind had fractured under pressure and rearranged itself into new patterns that no longer quite aligned with reality. But Isaac and Solomon both nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if the entire night had been an exercise in insanity and one more piece of madness hardly mattered. They divided the few supplies they had managed to grab in their flight, some cornbread wrapped in cloth, a water skin, flint and steel for making fire. Solomon and Ruth would leave first, heading east toward the rising sun. Isaac would wait an hour, then move north. Zeke and Tommy would follow the river south, staying close to the water where their scent would be harder for dogs to track. Before they separated, Isaac gripped Zeke's shoulder. What we did back there, I won't apologize for it. Won't pretend it was anything but what it was. We killed 14 people. Some of them probably deserved it by any measure. Some of them. He trailed off, thinking perhaps of young Josiah Fitch, the watchman who had never struck anyone. But they were all part of the machine that grinds us down, and the machine can't be reasoned with or reformed. It can only be broken. Or it breaks us, Zeke said. Maybe. But at least we broke back. They parted ways as the sun climbed higher, its light turning the river copper and gold, beautiful and indifferent. Solomon and Ruth disappeared into the trees heading east. Isaac waited by the bank, and Zeke watched him standing there, a 60-year-old man preparing to run for his life, and felt a kinship that transcended words. Then Zeke and Tommy were moving south, following the river through thick undergrowth that grabbed at their clothes and scratched their skin. They moved quickly at first, driven by fear and adrenaline, but as the morning wore on and the miles accumulated, exhaustion began to assert itself. Zeke had not slept in nearly 30 hours, had spent the night committing murder after murder, and his body was starting to rebel against the demands he had placed upon it. He began to see things that were not there. At first it was just shadows that moved wrong, shapes in his peripheral vision that dissolved when he turned to look directly at them. But as the sun climbed toward noon and the heat became oppressive, the hallucinations grew more elaborate. He saw Dalton Crow standing in the river, his throat gaping open, pointing at Zeke with an accusing finger. He saw Cordelia Blackridge hanging from a tree branch, her nightgown red with blood, her mouth moving in silent recrimination. He saw all 14 of them, the dead following the living, their faces pale and their wounds weeping. Zeke? Tommy's voice came from far away, though the boy walked right beside him. Zeke, you all right? I see them, Zeke whispered. I see all of them. They're following us. Tommy looked behind them, saw nothing but trees and undergrowth, and his young face creased with worry. There's nobody there. It's just us. But Zeke knew better. The dead were there, as real as the river, as real as the blood that still stained his hands despite multiple attempts to wash them clean. They walked behind him in a silent procession, witnesses to what he had become, jury and executioner combined. And ahead of them, somewhere in the shimmering heat, he saw 2 other figures, Temperance holding Mercy, both of them translucent and flickering like images seen through water. He reached toward them and they receded, always the same distance away no matter how fast he walked. "We need to rest," Tommy said, his hand on Zeke's arm, trying to pull him to a stop. "You're not making sense. You're seeing things that aren't real." "They're real," Zeke insisted. "More real than anything else. More real than freedom or justice or mercy. The dead are always real because we carry them with us. I'll carry these 14 until I die, and maybe after." They stopped in a grove of cypress trees where the ground was slightly higher and drier, and Tommy forced Zeke to sit, to drink water, to eat some of the cornbread though it turned to ashes in his mouth. The boy kept watch while Zeke drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams and waking thoughts bleeding together until he could no longer distinguish between them. In one vision he was back at Blackridge, but the plantation was empty of people, just buildings and fields and silence. In another he was on the auction block in Natchez, but when the auctioneer called for bids, the crowd was composed entirely of the men he had killed, and they were bidding on pieces of his soul. He woke to Tommy shaking him, urgency in the boy's voice. "Someone's coming. Dogs. I can hear them." Zeke struggled to his feet, his body protesting every movement, and listened. Yes. There it was. The distant baying of hounds, a sound that every enslaved person knew in their bones, the sound that announced pursuit and capture and punishment. They ran. The river became their lifeline and their enemy. They waded through shallows that sucked at their feet, swam across deeper channels that pulled them downstream, emerged gasping and exhausted on the far bank only to plunge back in when the dogs' cries grew louder. Time lost meaning. The sun moved across the sky, but whether they had been running for hours or days, Zeke could not have said. At some point Tommy fell, his foot catching on a submerged root, and Zeke pulled him up, half-dragged him forward. The boy's face had gone pale with exhaustion and fear, but he did not complain, did not ask to stop, just kept moving because stopping meant capture and capture meant death, or worse than death. The dogs were closer now, close enough that Zeke imagined he could smell them, close enough that the voices of the men who controlled them carried across the water. There. In the river. A gunshot cracked across the water, the bullet striking somewhere behind them, and Zeke dove beneath the surface, pulling Tommy down with him. They swam underwater until their lungs burned, surfaced gasping, and found themselves approaching a sharp bend where the river narrowed and accelerated, where white water foamed over rocks. Another gunshot. This one is closer. Zeke felt something tug at his shoulder, felt warm blood mix with river water, but there was no pain, just a distant acknowledgement that he had been hit. They went over the rapids together, tumbling and crashing through the current, and when Zeke surfaced on the other side, Tommy was gone. Tommy! He screamed the name, spinning in the water, searching frantically for any sign of the boy. Tommy! Nothing. The river had swallowed him, had taken him down into its brown depths and given nothing back. Zeke dove, searching, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest, but he could see nothing in the murky water, and could find no trace of the boy who had followed him to the very edge of the world. He surfaced, gasping, weeping, and the sound of dogs filled his ears like judgment. The dogs found only one body in the river that day, a young man, barely 16, his skull cracked open where it had struck a rock in the rapids, his face peaceful despite the violence of his death. They dragged him to shore and left him there while they continued their search for the other murderer, the one witnesses said was the ringleader, the stablehand who had started it all. They never found Ezekiel Thornwood. Some said he drowned farther downstream, his body carried all the way to the Mississippi and from there to the Gulf of Mexico, where the fish picked his bones clean and scattered them across the ocean floor. Others claimed he made it to the far bank and disappeared into the swamps, living like an animal among the alligators and water moccasins until fever or starvation or madness finally claimed him. A few whispered that he had been helped by abolitionists, spirited north through a network of safe houses until he crossed into Canada and freedom, though these whispers were always spoken quietly because even suggesting such a network existed was dangerous. The truth, as far as truth can be discerned from the fragments that remain, was something else entirely. Zeke crawled from the river 3 miles south of where Tommy died, hauled himself onto a muddy bank using his one good arm while his wounded shoulder screamed protest. The bullet had passed through the meat of his deltoid without hitting bone or major vessels, but the wound was deep and would fester without treatment. He lay in the mud and listened to the dogs growing fainter, moving in the wrong direction, following a false trail or perhaps simply giving up because night was falling and even hunting men had their limits. He should have felt something: relief, grief, triumph, despair. Instead, there was only the emptiness that had opened inside him when he killed Dalton Crow and had grown larger with each subsequent death until it had consumed everything that used to be Ezekiel Thornwood. He was a hollow man now, a shell that moved through the world but no longer participated in it, watching his own actions as if from a great distance. The hallucinations had stopped. The dead no longer followed him. Even temperance and mercy had vanished from his vision, and their absence was somehow worse than their ghostly presence had been. He had nothing left to move toward, no direction that held meaning, no purpose beyond the simple animal imperative to continue breathing. He stood eventually and walked south because south was the direction he had been moving and momentum was easier than decision. His clothes dried stiff with river mud and blood. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. He walked through the night and into the next day, stealing food from a smokehouse, drinking from streams, avoiding all human contact with the instinct of a wounded animal seeking a place to die. But he did not die. His body, trained by 28 years of brutal labor, refused to quit. The wound in his shoulder began to close, angry and red but not infected. He kept walking. Weeks blurred together. He moved through Mississippi like a ghost, seen occasionally but never caught, leaving a trail of rumors and sightings that the authorities could never quite verify. The wanted posters appeared in every town, $500 reward for the capture of Negro man named Ezekiel, approximately 28 years of age, scar on left hand, wanted for murder of 14 white persons at Blackridge Plantation. But the man in the poster bore little resemblance to the scarecrow figure that haunted the margins of civilization, and those who glimpsed him rarely reported what they saw, either from fear or from some instinct that telling the authorities would violate something fundamental. He reached Louisiana eventually, crossed the border in the dead of winter, and made his way to the sugar plantations that lined the Mississippi River. He watched from the tree lines as men and women and children worked the cane fields, their bodies bent under loads that should have been impossible for humans to carry, their skin glistening with sweat and blood from the sharp leaves that cut like knives. He searched for temperance and mercy in every field, scrutinized every woman's face, but he never found them. Perhaps they were dead. Perhaps they had been sold again. Perhaps they had never been real at all, just phantoms his mind had created to give meaning to the meaningless. One night he approached the quarters of a plantation whose name he never learned, drawn by the sound of singing, that low, rhythmic chanting that enslaved people used to mark time and maintain sanity, turning labor into something almost like prayer. An old woman sat outside her cabin smoking a pipe, and when she saw Zeke emerge from the darkness, she did not cry out. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. "Are you hungry?" she asked. He nodded. She brought him food, cornbread and beans and a piece of salt pork, and watched him eat with the fierce attention of someone who understood that feeding the desperate was a form of resistance. When he finished, she refilled his plate without being asked. "Are you running?" she said finally. "I was. Now I don't know what I'm doing." Most of us don't. We just keep breathing because stopping takes more courage than continuing. She drew on her pipe, exhaled smoke that hung in the still air. "You got blood on you. Not fresh blood, but the memory of blood. I can see it. I killed people. White people." "Yes." She nodded as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "How many?" 14. The number hung between them, huge and impossible. 14 white people dead by the hand of one enslaved man. It was the stuff of nightmares and whispered legends, the thing that white people feared more than fire or plague or divine judgment. "Good," the old woman said finally. "The world needs more killing like that. Needs people willing to pay the price for striking back. I lost everything. My wife, my daughter, my friend, my soul. I don't even know if I'm still human anymore. Being human is overrated when the world treats you like an animal. Sometimes you got to become the thing they fear most just to remind them you exist." She knocked ash from her pipe. "You can't stay here. Morning comes, the overseer makes his rounds, finds you, it'll be trouble for everyone. But there's a man 3 plantations north who helps runaways. Calls himself Marcus. Whether that's his real name or not, I couldn't say. He might be able to get you farther north, might be able to help you disappear properly." Zeke thought about Canada, about the stories of freedom in a place where slavery was illegal, where a black man could walk streets without papers, could own property, could live. The idea seemed fantastic, impossible, a fairy tale for the desperate. But impossible things happened. He had made impossible things happen. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Just survive. Survival is resistance. Living when they want you dead or broken is its own kind of revolution." The historical record goes quiet after that. Zeke vanishes from official documentation, becomes a rumor, becomes a story that enslaved people told each other in whispers, becomes the Blackridge Silent Revolt, a cautionary tale for white people and an inspiration for black people, interpreted differently depending on who was telling it and why. What is known is this: in the spring of 1848, a black man matching Zeke's description appeared in Memphis, was sheltered briefly by Quaker abolitionists, and disappeared again. In 1849, a similar figure surfaced in Ohio, working as a farmhand under an assumed name. By 1851, there were reports of a black stablehand in Ontario, Canada, living in a small community of formerly enslaved people who had made it across the border. This man called himself Ezra Thompson. He was quiet, spoke rarely, and was known to suffer from what people at the time called soldier's heart, what we would now recognize as profound trauma, the kind that rewrites a person's fundamental relationship with reality. He worked with horses, was good at it, and kept to himself. No one asked about his past because everyone in that community had pasts they preferred not to discuss. In 1862, when the American Civil War was raging and Canada was awash with escaped slaves fleeing north, an old woman arrived in the Ontario community seeking her husband and daughter, sold away from her 15 years earlier. Her name was Temperance. Her daughter, now a young woman of 17, was called Mercy. The records don't say definitively whether they found him, whether Ezra Thompson was actually Ezekiel Thornwood, whether the family torn apart by slavery's cruelty was somehow miraculously reunited by the random mercy of chance. Some accounts say yes, that there was a reunion of sorts, though the man who might have been Zeke no longer fully inhabited himself, had been so thoroughly broken and remade by what he had done and what had been done to him that he existed in only the most technical sense. Other accounts say Temperance and Mercy never found him, that Ezra Thompson was someone else entirely, that Zeke died in those Louisiana swamps or drowned in the Mississippi or simply faded away like smoke, his story ending in violence and emptiness and the terrible silence that follows catastrophic acts. What is certain is this: the Blackridge massacre was never forgotten. It entered the folklore of both white and black communities in Mississippi, transmitted across generations in different forms. White families told it as a horror story, a reminder of the dangers of treating enslaved people too softly, of the inherent savagery that lurked beneath the surface of even the most obedient slave. Black families told it differently, as a story of resistance, of a man who refused to accept the unacceptable, who struck back against a system designed to render him powerless. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either version. Zeke was not a hero or a villain but a man pushed past the limits of human endurance, who responded to systematic dehumanization with a violence that mirrored the violence enacted upon him daily. The 14 people he killed were individuals with their own stories, some more culpable than others, but all participating in a system that treated human beings as property and justified that treatment with scripture and pseudoscience and simple greed. The horror of the Blackridge massacre was not just the violence itself but the conditions that made such violence inevitable. Every plantation in the South was a potential Blackridge, every enslaved person a potential Zeke, because the mathematics of oppression always eventually produced explosions of rage, and those explosions were always met with overwhelming retaliation that only generated more rage, more violence, more suffering in an endless cycle. In 1897, 50 years after the Blackridge massacre, a journalist from Boston traveled to Ontario to interview formerly enslaved people about their experiences. Among those he spoke with was an elderly man who ran a small stable, training horses with remarkable gentleness and patience. The man called himself Ezra Thompson, claimed to be 78 years old, and was reluctant to speak about his past. But late one evening, after the journalist had proven himself sympathetic and trustworthy, the old man told a story. He spoke of a plantation in Mississippi, of a night when silence became a weapon, of 14 throats opened in the darkness, of a young man lost in rapids, of years spent running from something that could never be outrun because it lived inside him. "Did you regret it?" the journalist asked. "The killing?" The old man was quiet for a long time, his weathered hand stroking the neck of a mare who stood patiently beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Regret suggests a choice. Suggests I could have done something else. But there was no choice, not really. The choice had been made for me when they sold my wife and daughter, when they treated us like animals they could breed and separate and work to death. I was already dead. I just hadn't stopped moving yet. What I did that night. He trailed off, searching for words. It was a dead man's revenge. And dead men don't regret. They just haunt. Do you still see them? The ones you killed? Every night. Every single night for 50 years. They stand at the foot of my bed and watch me sleep. Sometimes they accuse. Sometimes they just watch. I think maybe they're waiting to see if what I did mattered, if it changed anything. Did it? The old man smiled, a tired expression that held no joy. Slavery ended, didn't it? Took a war and 600,000 dead, but it ended. Was my little revolt part of that? Maybe. Maybe it was one thread in a tapestry too large for any one person to see. Or maybe it was just murder, pure and simple, and I'll answer for it when my time comes. When do you think that will be? Soon. The old man looked at his hands, at the scars that covered them, at the tremble that had recently developed. I'm tired. Been tired for 50 years. Been alive when I should have died in that river with Tommy. I think maybe I've just been waiting for permission to stop, to finally rest. The journalist published his interviews in a book that was largely ignored upon release and is now nearly forgotten. The passage about Ezra Thompson was buried deep in the text, and most readers assumed it was either fabricated or embellished, because the idea that one enslaved man could kill 14 white people and escape to live another 50 years seemed too fantastic to be real. But in a small cemetery in Ontario, there is a gravestone dated 1899 that reads, Ezra Thompson, born unknown, died free. And beside it, two other graves, Temperance Thornwood Thompson and Mercy Thornwood Thompson. Whether this represents a truth or simply a story that became real through the telling, no one can say with certainty. On certain October nights in Mississippi, when the air hangs thick and still and the moon casts long shadows, people claim to hear something strange coming from where Blackridge Plantation once stood, before the land was sold and subdivided, before the main house was rebuilt by different owners who knew nothing of its history, before time and deliberate forgetting erased most evidence that the massacre ever occurred. They hear silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of held breath, of waiting, of something poised between before and after. And in that silence, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear the whisper of a whetstone against a blade, the soft breathing of horses in a stable, the sound of a man becoming something other than human in order to strike back against a system designed to destroy his humanity. The Blackridge silent revolt remains what it has always been, a ghost story and a true story, a horror and a resistance, a warning and a promise. It asks uncomfortable questions about violence and justice, about the difference between murder and revolution, about what happens to people when they are pushed past the point where survival requires compliance. And it whispers a truth that every system of oppression tries to deny, that silence, when weaponized by the desperate, can be louder than any scream, and more devastating than any open rebellion. In the hayloft of a barn in Ontario, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath loose boards, there is a knife. Its blade is still sharp despite decades of disuse. Its handle is worn smooth by hands that held it through a night of blood and death and transformation. It waits there still, a relic of resistance, a reminder that the enslaved did not always accept their chains, did not always go quietly into the darkness of subjugation. And on the blade, if you look closely enough in the right light, you can still see faint stains that might be rust or might be something else entirely, the residue of a night when 14 throats opened in silence, and the world changed in ways both subtle and profound, rippling outward through time like rings on water, touching lives not yet born, asking questions not yet answered. The silence of Blackridge still echoes. And in that echo, if you listen carefully, you can hear not just the horror of what was done, but the deeper horror of what made it necessary, a system so cruel, so absolute in its denial of humanity, that 14 deaths in the darkness became not just possible but inevitable. That is the true horror. That is what lingers. That is what we must never forget. If this story has moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about resistance and oppression, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. History is full of silences. Sometimes we need to listen to what those silences are trying to tell us.